In the middle of a dusty marketplace, a young woman stood trembling as her own father sold her before the crowd, calling her useless, unfit to bear a child. From the silence, a widowed man appeared, a rancher who lived alone with 5 small children in a weathered house on the edge of dry land. He didn't bargain. He didn't ask her name. He simply looked at her, long and steady, as if seeing in those tearful eyes the last flicker of something human. In that moment, both their fates changed. From shame, she stepped into a house heavy with silence and began to warm it, with kindness and with a quiet belief that goodness still mattered. But can love truly grow in barren soil and shadow? Or will it be swept away by judgment and loss? Stay with us a little longer. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you still believe that kindness can heal even the tiredest of souls. Subscribe, so you'll never miss the next story that mends the heart. Ash Hollow, New Mexico. Spring, 1884. The sun rose through a curtain of dust that seemed to hang between earth and heaven, soft and cruel all at once. It clung to wagons, to traders' awnings, to the faces of men and women who had long forgotten the scent of clean air. Horses stamped in the heat. Flies circled over baskets of onions and dried beans, and the smell of tanned leather mingled with sweat and the faint sweetness of cornbread left too long in the sun. It was a morning that carried both life and resignation. The kind of morning where nothing remarkable should have happened, and yet something did. At the edge of the square stood a young woman, too still, too pale for the season. Her name was Clara Wynne, 22, dressed in a faded blue cotton dress that had lost its color to the wind and her father's temper. Her hands were clasped tight before her, the knuckles white as she stared at the ground. The hat shading her face was old, the brim bent and frayed, and her patched shoes sank slightly into the dust each time she shifted her weight. Around her, voices swelled and fell like the tide, buyers haggling, mothers calling to their children, until her father's voice rose above them all, sharp as a whip. She can cook, sew, keep quiet. That's worth something. Laughter flickered somewhere in the crowd, the kind of laughter that bruises. A few men leaned forward, amused, their eyes crawling over her like insects. Others turned away, ashamed to be caught looking. The women did not speak. They simply clutched their baskets tighter, their mouths thin lines that said, "This is not our fight." Clara's father, Henry Wynne, was a man of 50 with sunburned skin, thinning hair slicked back with sweat, and a jaw that clenched every time someone dared meet his gaze. He had once been a ranch hand, proud of his strength, but debt and whiskey had carved him down to something smaller, meaner. Beside him stood his wife, Clara's mother, wrapped in a faded shawl. She looked older than her years, her face drawn and colorless, lips trembling as though she might speak. But she didn't. She only stared at her daughter, and when Clara's eyes found hers, the woman looked away. The moment stretched. Wind swept through the square, lifting bits of hay, swirling dust around Clara's hem. Her heart beat too loud in her ears, and the smell of hot iron and horse leather pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. Then, through the shifting light, a man's shadow fell across the table. He was tall, the kind of tall that came from years in the saddle. A broad-shouldered cowboy in a sun-bleached duster, hat pulled low against the glare. The band of it was cracked, the brim sweat-stained, and dust clung to his boots like an old companion. When he lifted his head, the light caught a face carved by weather and silence, skin darkened by sun, stubble silvering along his jaw, and gray eyes that seemed to measure the world, without hurry. This was Eli Thatcher, 40 years old, a widower who had buried more than he spoke of, a man who had driven cattle from Amarillo to Santa Fe and seen too many sunsets to be easily impressed. His hands were large and scarred, smelling faintly of saddle leather, smoke, and the long miles between towns. There was something in the way he stood, quiet, grounded, as if even the earth leaned toward him for steadiness. He did not haggle, did not ask for her name. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, the kind that could calm a skittish horse or silence a room. "She won't be judged here." A coin dropped onto the wooden table, its dull clink swallowed by the wind. Her father's fingers closed over it with a speed that made the watching crowd shift uneasily. No one cheered. No one stopped it. By sundown, Clara sat in the back of a wagon rolling west, her hair whipping behind her in the dry wind. The sky was painted in the bruised colors of dusk, and the road wound through the low hills where cactus flowers tried to bloom against reason. She glanced sideways at the man beside her, the cowboy who had bought her life with a single coin. He held the reins loosely, his posture easy, the rhythm of the horses matched to his breath. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Every creak of the wagon was a heartbeat. Every breath of wind was a memory she wished she could forget. Her father's voice, her mother's silence, the weight of a bargain struck in daylight. The air smelled of sagebrush and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to one another, their cries rising thin against the wide, empty sky. Hours passed. The sun disappeared behind the mesas, and a faint glow of lantern light marked their approach to a valley below. Clara's body ached, but she didn't ask how far they had to go. She didn't ask anything at all. Only once did she steal a glance at the man. The way his jaw tightened when the wheels hit a rut. The faint weariness in his eyes. There was no cruelty there. No claim of ownership. Only a silence that seemed to have been with him for a very long time. When the wagon finally stopped, the moon had risen, pale and wide, over the horizon. In front of them stood a tilted house, the kind that looked as though it had bent under the weight of the years, but refused to fall. Its porch sagged. One shutter hung loose, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. The land around it stretched dry and cracked, broken by patches of stubborn grass and an old oak tree that clawed at the sky. Eli stepped down first, dust rising around his boots. He turned and offered a hand. She hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his, the first touch of gentleness she'd felt in months. His hand was warm, steady, calloused, but not harsh. For a moment, the world grew very still. Then, from the doorway of the house, came the sound of shuffling feet. 5 children stood there, silent, wide-eyed, their faces half hidden in the flicker of lamplight. The eldest boy, perhaps 12, had his father's gray eyes and the wary look of someone older than his years. Beside him, 2 younger boys clung to each other, while a small girl with braids rubbed sleep from her eyes. The youngest, barely 4, peeked from behind the doorframe, clutching a worn cloth doll against her chest. Clara froze. The wagon's wheels clicked softly as they settled in the dirt. Eli glanced toward the children, then back at her. His voice was low when he finally spoke, almost a whisper, almost a confession. They don't have a mother. And just like that, the night swallowed the rest of the words. The wind moved through the oak leaves, the lantern flickered, and somewhere deep inside her chest, Clara felt something stir, Not fear, not hope, but the fragile tremor of a life beginning again in the quietest of places. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled into the yard, the last breath of dusk fading into night. The house stood still, a shape of tired wood and forgotten laughter. Wind whispered through the cracks in its walls, carrying the scent of smoke and sage, and somewhere a loose shutter clapped against the siding like an old memory refusing to sleep. The man tied the horse, lifted the lantern from the wagon, and pushed open the door with a sound that seemed older than either of them. Inside, the air smelled of ash and boiled coffee. Shadows leaned long against the floorboards, stretching toward a small table where 5 plates had been neatly set, though not one held a meal. Clara stepped across the threshold, her feet sinking into the worn rug. The silence was so thick she could hear the steady rhythm of her own breath. From the corner, the children stared, not fearful, not welcoming, simply waiting to see what this stranger would become. Eli set the lantern down, its light touching his face in gold and shadow. His hat hung low, dust clinging to its brim. The faint jingle of his spurs broke the silence for a heartbeat before he unbuckled them and set them aside. "You can sleep in the back room," he said quietly, the words careful, deliberate, as if afraid they might break something fragile. Clara nodded, clutching the hem of her dress. She wanted to thank him, but the word "thank you" felt too heavy for her dry mouth. So she just walked past him, her fingers brushing the rough door frame, and entered a room where the walls carried the faint scent of lilacs long gone. Morning came slowly. The sun spilled through the gaps in the shutters like thin rivers of light. Clara rose early, though she hadn't really slept, and wandered to the kitchen. The shelves were sparse: a sack of flour, a jar of salt, a few shriveled potatoes. She rolled up her sleeves and tried to bake, her hands trembling slightly as she mixed what little she could find. The bread rose in the oven, then sank again, collapsing into a pale, heavy lump. She pretended not to notice when the eldest boy whispered to the others, their small shoulders shaking in silent amusement. She swept, scrubbed, mended stitched socks until her fingers cracked. The house seemed to resist her. Doors that wouldn't close, floors that groaned in protest, curtains too thin to hold back the light. Yet she kept at it, her motions small and measured, as though each stitch and scrub might somehow make her part of this place. But every night, when she passed the children sitting quietly at the table, their eyes followed her like ghosts. None spoke, not even the smallest. Eli came and went, tending the cattle beyond the ridge. He rode out each morning at first light, the rhythm of his horse echoing across the valley until it became part of the land's own heartbeat. When he returned, his boots carried dust and his shoulders carried silence. He ate whatever she placed before him, not praising, not complaining, simply eating like a man who had long forgotten the art of conversation. Once, when she reached to clear his plate, their hands brushed. He drew his back gently, not in rejection, but in caution, as though afraid of disturbing the thin peace that held their world together. Days slipped by. Maybe 3, maybe 4, slow and fragile, each one like a test of silence. The children began to move around her like quiet shadows. The eldest, Noah, about 12, helped bring in firewood without being asked, his jaw set in a way that reminded her of Eli. Sam and Thomas, the twin boys, raced each other across the yard, but fell silent whenever she stepped outside. Lydia, the one with braids, sometimes hummed near the porch when she thought no one listened. And little Mira, the youngest, liked to sit by the window with her doll, watching the wind chase the dust. One evening, as the sun bled red across the hills, Clara set a pot of stew on the stove. The smell of herbs filled the room, a small victory she didn't allow herself to celebrate. She reached for a ladle, her hands slick from washing, and the pot slipped, crashing against the floor, spilling hot broth and bits of potato across the boards. The sound was thunderous in that quiet house. Her breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't move. The instinct rose sharp and fast, brace for the strike, the shout, the insult that would follow. But none came. Eli turned from his chair, stood, and crossed the room. He knelt beside her, his knees pressing into the puddle of stew, and began picking up the shards. His voice was low, that same quiet tone that could calm a wild horse. "Just stew," he said simply. Nothing more. Clara blinked. Her heart beat so loudly she could barely hear him. She bent down to help, her fingers trembling. For a brief second, their hands met again, and this time, neither pulled away. Later, when the floor was clean and the children sent to bed, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of juniper and smoke. Above her, stars flickered like distant promises, the kind people used to make before the world grew too hard. She drew her knees to her chest and watched the horizon fade into blue darkness. For the first time since she'd left the market, she felt tears rise, quiet and unforced, as if they belonged not to shame, but to something gentler. The ache of being seen, if only for a moment. Behind her, the door creaked open. A faint glow from the lantern spilled across the boards. Mira's small figure stood there, blanket in hand, her hair tangled and eyes glassy with sleep. Clara smiled softly, motioning her back to bed, but the girl just stood still, shivering. Then came the cough. Sharp, dry, wrong. It tore through the quiet like a nail dragged across wood. The sound was small, but it filled the night with dread. Clara rose at once, her heart lurching. Mira swayed, clutching her doll, her lips, parted as another cough, racked her small chest. Eli appeared in the doorway, his face carved in worry. The brim of his hat cast a dark line across his eyes as he stepped forward, moving with the sure, protective instinct of a man who had pulled foals from winter storms and carried dying men from desert trails. He reached for the child, but Clara was already there, kneeling, one hand on the girl's forehead. It burned under her palm. Eli met her eyes. No words were needed. The silence that had once held the house together now trembled on the edge of breaking. The stars above flickered once, faintly, and went still. Night wrapped the house in a silence so deep it seemed to breathe. The fire in the hearth had died hours ago, leaving only the faint smell of ash and a curl of gray smoke drifting like a ghost toward the rafters. Clara moved quietly through the small room, her bare feet whispering against the cold floorboards. Mira lay on the bed beneath a thin quilt, her small chest rising and falling too quickly, cheeks flushed with fever. The girl's doll rested beside her, its button eyes staring into the dark. Clara's hands shook as she poured water into a tin pot. She crushed the dried leaves of wild mint and willow bark with the back of a spoon, the sharp scent filling the air. Steam rose, thin, silver, alive for a heartbeat before it vanished. She remembered her mother's voice teaching her the remedy long ago, half song, half prayer, in a kitchen that no longer existed. The rhythm of it came back to her now, unbidden, as if the words themselves carried healing. Eli stepped into the doorway, boots silent on the worn rug. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, forearms marked faintly by old rope burns. The the kind a cowboy carries from years of pulling reins and breaking colts. His face was drawn but steady, eyes alert in that way of men who have kept watch beside dying campfires. He didn't ask questions. He simply watched what she did and moved to help. He fetched more water from the basin, wrung out clothes, laid them across the child's burning forehead. Every few minutes he'd glance at Clara, as if taking quiet instruction. She didn't notice the way he studied her hands, or the steadiness that had replaced her earlier trembling. The night stretched long. The wind outside hissed against the shutters, and the house creaked as though listening. One by one, the other children had fallen asleep, gathered on blankets near the hearth. Only the occasional sigh broke the stillness. Clara stayed at Mira's bedside, dabbing her brow, cooling her wrists, humming a lullaby her mother never finished teaching her, a tune made of fragments and hope. The melody drifted through the cabin like candlelight, soft and uncertain, but somehow strong enough to keep the darkness at bay. From time to time, Eli stepped outside to fill the bucket with snowmelt. The cold bit at his skin, frost forming on his short beard, his breath thick in the lamplight. The old gelding nickered softly in the corral, the only other soul awake in the valley. Eli paused for a moment, resting a hand on the horse's neck, the steady heartbeat beneath his palm grounding him more than prayer ever had. Then he turned back toward the cabin, boots crunching lightly over frost. He didn't speak much, only small words. More water? Or she's cooler now. But in those simple exchanges, something began to shift. A quiet trust forming in the silence between two people who had known too much of loneliness. Hours passed. Clara lost track of them. The fever came and went in waves, Mira's body twisting in restless dreams. Once, the girl whispered something, a name Clara couldn't catch, and the sound made her heart ache. She wiped the child's lips, murmuring gentle words no one had ever said to her when she'd needed them most. Eli watched from the shadows, his hands gripping the chair back until his knuckles whitened. He had faced storms, droughts, and death itself, but never this kind of helplessness. The terror of watching something small and precious burn from the inside. Sometime near dawn, the wind calmed. The lantern's flame trembled low, throwing a faint amber halo over the bed. Mira's breathing softened. Clara brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead. The child's eyelids fluttered, her lips parting just enough to whisper one word. Pancakes. Clara's breath caught, and then she laughed, softly, in disbelief. A sound like sunlight breaking through clouds. She looked up to find Eli standing in the doorway, shoulders slumped, exhaustion written deep into the lines of his face. His hat hung from one hand, his other braced against the frame as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Relief, gratitude, and a small, impossible tenderness neither dared name. He stepped closer, kneeling beside the bed. His hand reached out, hesitated, then rested gently on his daughter's arm. "She'll be hungry when she wakes," Clara said, her voice low, almost shy. Eli nodded, his lips curving in the faintest smile. The weight that had lived in his shoulders for years seemed to lift, just a little, like a door opening to fresh air. The morning light crept through the shutters, pale and forgiving. The children stirred, blinking sleep from their eyes. When they saw Mira breathing evenly, they gathered around the bed, silent at first, then whispering to one another as if afraid to break a fragile miracle. Clara smiled at them and motioned toward the door. Let's let her rest, she whispered. They obeyed, following her into the yard. Outside, the world looked reborn. The night's frost was melting, turning the soil dark and rich. The wind carried the faint scent of juniper, and a bird, the first she'd heard since her arrival, called from the fence post. Clara knelt to fill the wash basin, and one by one the children came closer. Noah with his arms folded, pretending indifference, the twins chasing each other through the dust, Lydia standing near her with a cautious smile. Even little Thomas handed her a bucket without being asked. It was as if something invisible had shifted, the center of gravity in their world. They hovered around her now, not as strangers, but as small, uncertain satellites drawn toward warmth. Eli watched from the porch, arms crossed loosely over his chest, hat tilted forward, a faint disbelief in his expression. The wind caught his coat, lifting the dust around, his boots, and he stood there like some old sentinel of the plains, quiet, rooted, and maybe for the first time in years, at peace. He had not realized until that moment how still the house had been, or how much laughter could sound like prayer. By noon, Mira's fever had broken. The children helped Clara hang wet clothes in the sun, the wind catching them like white sails. A kind of peace settled over the homestead, fragile, new, but real. The silence that once haunted the rooms now felt different, softer, almost grateful. As evening fell, Clara washed the dishes by the window, the sky turning the color of copper and smoke. The children's laughter drifted faintly from the yard where they played, their voices mingling with the steady creak of the windmill. For the first time in years, Eli's home sounded alive. She rinsed a bowl, smiled to herself, and reached for another. Then she heard it, faint footsteps beyond the fence. Slow, hesitant, voices carried by the wind. Someone was whispering her name. She froze, the plate still in her hands, water dripping from her fingers. The twilight pressed close around the house. The voices came again, closer this time, murmured, uncertain, but unmistakably from the direction of town. Her name, Clara Wynne, spoken like a secret someone had dug up from the dust. The lantern on the sill flickered once, and the sound of laughter from the yard faded into stillness. The morning broke clear over Ash Hollow, all pale gold and dust. The kind of morning that made the land look honest again after a long night of whispers. The children were in the yard feeding the hens, their laughter carried by the wind. Clara stood by the porch rail, her apron dusted with flour, watching the horizon shimmer. The faint smell of sage and wood smoke filled the air. For once the world seemed steady, the kind of steady she never trusted for long. Eli hitched the wagon by the fence, the boards creaking as he loaded the last of the grain sacks. The brim of his weathered hat shaded his eyes, and his movements were slow, methodical. The quiet rhythm of a man who had spent half his life working with wind and hooves instead of words. "Need anything from town?" he asked without looking up, the low drawl in his voice still carrying the trace of the trail. She hesitated, brushing her hands on her apron. There was a spool of thread she'd been saving to buy. Maybe some salt. Maybe just a reason to step into a world that still pretended she didn't exist. "I'll come with you," she said softly. Eli gave a small nod, the kind that meant all right, without words. The road to Dust Bend twisted through the dry hills. The earth cracked like old pottery. They passed a stand of mesquite trees, a stream no wider than a ribbon, a few ranchers tipping their hats in quiet recognition. Eli returned the gesture with that same cowboy's ease, 2 fingers to the brim, a nod that spoke of mutual solitude. In the wagon bed behind them, a burlap sack of corn shifted with each bump. Clara sat with her hands folded, eyes half closed against the sun. The wind tugged at the ends of her hair, carrying the smell of town long before the buildings came into view. Soap, tobacco, horses, and the sharp tang of gossip that lingered in every corner. Dustbend was awake before noon. The market stretched along the main street, stalls shaded by frayed canvas awnings, the air filled with the murmur of voices and the occasional clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Women in calico dresses haggled over beans and soap. Men leaned against wagon wheels, trading stories that sounded like warnings. Clara stepped down from the wagon and smoothed her skirt, her pulse quickening. Eyes followed her. A few too long, a few too knowing. She walked beside Eli to the general store. Inside, the smell of flour and molasses mingled with the cool shadow. She gathered a few things: salt, thread, a small packet of yeast, her hands careful, almost ritualistic. Eli paid, tipping his hat to the clerk with the faint courtesy of a trailman who still believed respect cost nothing. Together, they stepped back into the sun. But the moment they did, a sound cut through the market noise. Laughter, sharp as a blade. Under the awning across the street stood two women. One, tall and pale, her dress the color of new cream, her posture proud and still. The other, older, her, face drawn tight as a drum, eyes small and cruel under a black bonnet. The elder spoke first, her voice pitched to carry. "Well, look who returns, the barren one." Her words rolled out slow, deliberate, like a curse that had been waiting for an audience. Clara froze. Heat flushed her cheeks, but her fingers stayed still at her sides. The younger woman smirked, a kind of smile that wasn't one at all. "Can't even give a man a child," she said, her tone sweet and poisoned. What a blessing Eli doesn't know yet. For a heartbeat, the market held its breath. The sound of the wind through the awnings turned brittle, like paper tearing. Someone dropped a basket, beans scattering into the dust. Clara wanted to move, to walk away, to vanish into the quiet safety of the wagon. But her feet wouldn't obey. She felt every eye on her, judging, measuring, remembering. Then came the sound of boots against the wooden porch behind her. Slow, certain, with the muted jingle of worn spurs. Eli stepped out of the general store, a sack of salt slung easily over one shoulder. The light hit his face, cutting across the lines of it. Not anger, but something steadier, colder. The look of a man who'd once stared down storms, men, and fate with the same quiet defiance. He looked first at Clara, then at the women. When he spoke, his voice was even, but it carried like a bell through the square. The voice of a cowboy who'd long ago learned that words meant more when used sparingly. "She's the reason my children laugh again," he said. The words fell heavy, undeniable. "She's the reason that house feels like a home." Silence followed, a deep, rippling silence that reached every corner of the market. The elder woman's mouth tightened, her pride retreating behind the shield of her bonnet. The younger looked away first, feigning boredom, but her hands twisted in her gloves. Clara didn't move. She couldn't. The only sound was the wind shifting the awning, and somewhere far off, a horse snorting as if to punctuate the moment. Eli turned to her, voice softer now. "Are you ready to head home?" She nodded, eyes lowered, her throat too tight for words. They walked together through the quiet that followed them like a wake. The ride back to the homestead was different. The same wind, the same road, but the weight in her chest had changed. She stared at her hands resting in her lap, the skin rough and chapped from work, and thought of how he had said home. Not house, not land, but home. She didn't speak until they reached the ridge, when the sun had begun its slow descent into orange and gold. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Eli didn't answer at first. He pulled the reins, guiding the horse around a rut, his gaze fixed on the long stretch of light ahead. When he did speak, his voice was low, patient, carrying the same timbre that had once soothed restless cattle and frightened children alike. "I wasn't defending you," he said. "I was telling the truth." Something fragile in her broke, not the kind of breaking that hurts, but the kind that makes room for air. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the kind that no longer felt heavy. By nightfall, the house glowed with the soft amber of lamplight. The children were already asleep, the younger ones curled near the hearth, the older ones sprawled in tired heaps of blankets. Clara set the table for morning, folded the dishcloths, and finally sat by the window. Outside, the yard shimmered silver under the moon. Eli sat on the porch, sharpening his knife, a habit learned from years on the trail, the steady scrape of steel against stone keeping rhythm with the crickets. Between them, the lantern burned low, flickering like the heartbeat of something fragile but alive. She spoke without turning. "You didn't have to defend me," she whispered again, as if trying to understand it. From the porch, his reply drifted through the half-open door. "I wasn't defending you. I was telling the truth." The words settled over her like warmth. She closed her eyes, her shoulders easing. The old walls seemed to breathe around them. Then, a sound, soft, off measure, from outside, near the barn. Eli paused, head lifting slightly. The old instinct, the one that had saved him on the range more times than luck, sparked in his eyes. Clara froze, listening. The wind had died, but there, beneath it, came the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps, uneven, dragging. A voice followed, low and slurred, breaking through the quiet like a stone through glass. Clara. Her name, stretched and heavy, soaked in liquor and memory. The voice of a man who should not have known where to find her. She stood, the lantern flame trembling. Outside, shadows moved, long, uncertain, reaching toward the barn. The crickets went silent. The night held its breath. The voice came again, closer this time, raw and dragging through the night air. "Clara Wynne." The words slurred with drink, thick as the dust they carried on. Eli was already on his feet before the last syllable faded, the lantern in his hand throwing a thin line of gold across the yard. The sound of his boots against the porch boards was steady, not rushed, not panicked, just that measured rhythm of a man who'd faced worse things than darkness. Clara followed, her heart a wild drumbeat against her ribs. Outside, the moon hung low, and by the barn door stood a man swaying on his feet, his coat torn, hair matted, and eyes glinting like shards of broken glass. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that hadn't seen water in weeks. A knife hung loosely at his belt, though his hands were too unsteady to reach for it. The smell of whiskey hit before his words did. "Didn't think I'd see the one they sold," he sneered, his voice cracking into laughter that never found its breath. "Thought the fancy rancher might have thrown you out by now." His teeth flashed in the dim light, yellow and sharp. Clara stepped back, every muscle tight. "Go home, Clay," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't belong here." He laughed harder, a wet sound that made the night colder. "Home? You mean the hills?" He spat in the dirt. That place was never mine, but you—" He pointed at her, his hand shaking. "You were once, weren't you? A fine trade you made." Eli moved before the insult fully left his mouth. The lantern light caught the swing of his arm, the same precise, brutal grace of a cowboy breaking a horse gone wild. His fist met Clay's jaw with a dull crack, a sound like a gunshot swallowed by dust. The trapper hit the ground hard, blood spilling from his nose, his hat rolling into the barn shadows. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Even the crickets stopped. Clay groaned, curling in the dirt, whiskey running down his chin in dark streaks. Eli stood over him, chest rising, knuckles raw and red beneath the lantern glow. His voice came low, steady as stone, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. "You'll leave this place now." Clay wiped his mouth, spat blood, and staggered to his knees. "You'll regret that," he rasped, but there was no fight left in him. He stumbled toward the ridge, his footsteps uneven, fading into the dark until the night swallowed him whole. Clara exhaled only when she heard the last crunch of gravel. The lantern trembled slightly in Eli's grip. "You all right?" he asked without looking at her. She nodded, though her hands were still shaking. When they stepped back inside, the children were huddled by the hearth, wide-eyed and silent. Eli crouched beside them, hat still in his hand, voice calm again, the same tone he'd used to soothe a skittish horse. "It's over," he said quietly. "Go on now. Back to bed." Later, when the house had gone still again, Clara sat by the wash basin with a bowl of water. Eli's hand rested on the table, the skin split across his knuckles, dried blood turning dark at the edges. His hat hung on the chair beside him, his shoulders slumped in quiet exhaustion. "Let me," she said, dipping the cloth and pressing it gently against his hand. He winced but didn't pull away. The firelight flickered across his face. The sharp lines softened now, showing not rage but something deeper: fatigue, care, restraint. "I don't like fighting," he muttered after a while, gaze drifting to the window. "Done too much of it on the trail." "I don't like being saved," she whispered back, "but I've never been until now." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Quiet, unguarded, the kind that fall between two people when neither is pretending anymore. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The house creaked as if listening. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, the world holding still in the hush that follows truth. The drought came soon after. The river behind the ridge shrank to a trickle. The air turned brittle, full of grit that found its way into every corner of the house. Days stretched long and bone dry. The chickens stopped laying and the cattle grew restless, their ribs showing sharp beneath their hides. Eli mended fences and checked the well, his movements slower now, burdened by a heat that never lifted. Clara worked from dawn to dusk, sleeves rolled to her elbows, face streaked with dust and sweat. She dug through the cracked earth with her bare hands, planting what seeds she had left: beans, corn, anything that might take root. He offered help, but she shook her head. "You mend the fences," she said. "I'll mend the ground." And he understood. She wasn't just planting food. She was proving that life could grow again where people had once given up. When her palms split, she wrapped them with cloth torn from an old dress. When the wind rose, she sang softly into it, the same lullaby she'd once used to soothe Mira. The tune drifted across the dry fields, half prayer, half defiance. The children followed her example. Noah carried buckets from the well, even when the rope burned his hands. Lydia kept the younger ones in shade, fanning them with branches. Eli watched from the porch, his jaw set, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. He'd seen droughts before, had watched cattle die and men curse the heavens. But never had he seen someone fight the dust with that kind of quiet, relentless faith. Weeks passed. The land gave nothing back. Yet every morning, Clara returned to the same patch of soil by the fence. "Just one," she whispered to it, brushing away dust. "Just one." Then one dawn, 7 weeks since the last rain, she saw it. A small burst of red against the brown. A tomato, tiny and perfect, clinging to the vine like a heartbeat that refused to die. She called for Eli, her voice trembling. He came running, boots kicking up dirt, the sun just breaking over his shoulder. The look on his face was something she hadn't seen before. Awe, quiet and deep. For a man who had once lived by the trail, who had lost count of sunrises and graves, it was as if he was seeing a miracle for the first time. Clara knelt, her hands hovering above the fruit, afraid to touch it. Eli reached out, resting his calloused palm gently on her shoulder. "Not everything worth keeping comes easy," he said, voice roughened by wind and years. She looked up at him, her lips parting, but no words came. Around them, the dry wind lifted, carrying the faint scent of life, green and sharp, like rain remembered. The tomato glistened in the light, fragile, impossible, real. For the first time in months, Clara smiled without needing to hide it. That evening, they ate supper in silence. The children dozed by the fire. The lantern swayed slightly with the wind. Clara cleared the table, humming under her breath, the taste of hope still fresh on her tongue. Eli had gone out to the barn to check the horses, his quiet ritual when the world felt uncertain. When she finished, she reached for the cloth to wipe the table and saw it. A folded note, half hidden beneath the lamp. The paper was creased, dirt-stained, but the writing was firm, deliberate. She opened it slowly, her pulse quickening. "The railroad men come tomorrow." The words sat heavy on the page, darker than ink should be. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves in the distance. Or maybe it was just her heartbeat echoing through the quiet. The lantern flickered once, as if uncertain whether to burn brighter or fade. Morning came slowly, heavy with the scent of dust and sunlight. The windmill creaked with its usual weary rhythm, and somewhere in the distance, hooves struck the hard earth, steady, deliberate. Clara moved through the house in her quiet way, boiling water, folding linens, setting out the bread she'd baked before dawn. The children, older now, were already in the yard tending the hens, laughter drifting through the open window. For a while, the world seemed to breathe easy again, until the sound of carriage wheels broke the stillness. 2 men arrived at the gate, strangers in polished boots and coats too fine for this land. They carried the air of the city with them, that mix of confidence and condescension that didn't belong under this sky. One was young, smooth-faced, with a mustache trimmed to precision. The other, older, heavier, flipped open a pocket watch that gleamed in the sun, the metal flashing like a small insult to the dust around them. Eli stepped from the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. His hat shaded his eyes, the lines of his face carved deep from years of wind and light. "Morning," he said simply, his voice the calm drawl of a man who didn't bend easy. The younger one smiled, the kind of smile that belonged behind a desk, not on horseback. "Mr. Thatcher, we've heard of your place," he said, gesturing toward the ridges. Beautiful property. Would make fine ground for the new railway line. Right through those hills. We're offering fair money. Handsome money. Clara stood by the window, her hands still on the teapot, watching. Inside, the men spread their map across the table, lines drawn in ink like veins cutting through the land, through pastures and over the oak grove, slicing right through the heart of their fields. Eli leaned over it, his shadow stretching long across the wood. The older man cleared his throat. It's progress, sir. The line will bring business, trade, new life to this valley. His tone softened, practiced, polished. You'd be doing the territory a favor. But Eli's eyes had already drifted toward the window, past the men, past the table, to the old oak beyond the fence. Its branches still stretched wide and sure, the same way they had the day he buried hope under them and found it again. The swing beneath it swayed lightly in the wind, though no child sat there now. He saw the ghosts of laughter, Mira's voice, Clara calling the children in for supper, and the sound of the land breathing like something alive. He shook his head once. No, he said quietly. The young man frowned. Mr. Thatcher, perhaps you don't understand. Eli's voice cut through him, soft but final. I understand fine. He set both hands on the table, his knuckles scarred and sure. But this land isn't for sale. The air went still. Even the ticking clock seemed to wait. The older man sighed and snapped his pocket watch shut. You're making a mistake, he said flatly. Eli didn't look up. Maybe, but it's mine to make. The men gathered their maps, boots clicking too sharply on his floorboards. When they stepped back into the sun, their shadows looked small against the wide plain. Their carriage rolled away, the sound of its wheels fading into the wind until the valley was quiet again. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her apron fluttering in the breeze. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look she gave him, proud, steady, was all the answer he needed. Later, Eli stood alone at the window. The map still lay open on the table, its inked lines cutting through the valley like scars. He stared at them for a long time, then folded it once, slow and deliberate, before tossing it into the stove. The paper curled and blackened, the lines burning away until nothing was left but ash. He stepped outside and leaned against the porch rail. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth and pine. The wheat shifted gently in the field. Somewhere a horse snorted. The sound felt like breathing again. That evening, when the sky burned copper, he and Clara worked by the fence. Eli brought the plank. Clara held the lantern. The sign was cut from an old oak board, smoothed by years of weather. He carved each letter slow and deep, his knife steady in his hand, the same rhythm he'd once used to whittle spurs and saddle horns by the campfire. Clara traced the grooves when he finished, the letters uneven but proud. Not for sale. Together, they lifted it into place. The hammer strikes echoed across the valley, soft, steady, like a heartbeat. When it stood firm, they stepped back shoulder to shoulder. The last light of day touched the sign, and for a moment, it glowed. A quiet declaration against the world. The years unfolded like a long trail, storms and summers, dust and bloom. There were winters when frost climbed the windows, and summers when the sky itself seemed to crack with heat. But the land endured, and so did they. The laughter of children once more filled the yard, and Clara's voice, that low, steady hum, became part of the wind itself. Time, like dust, settled gently over everything. Seasons turned, and the rains finally came, heavy and kind, washing the valley clean. The fields grew wild again. Tomatoes climbed past the fence. Sunflowers bent their golden heads over the porch rail. The children grew, left, returned, bringing new laughter and new silence. Clara's hair silvered beneath the light, her smile still bright as the morning she'd first arrived. Years later, Eli carved again, not into a sign, but into the wooden arch above the garden gate. The knife trembled slightly in his aging hand, but his eyes were steady. The words came slow and sure, each letter a memory. She bore no blood of mine, but she gave me the rest of my life. Clara found him sitting there, dust on his boots, the knife beside him. "You never needed to write that," she whispered. He smiled faintly, that same quiet cowboy smile that hid more than it showed. "I didn't write it for me." When she passed, the house grew too large for his breathing. Eli buried her beneath the oak, the same one that had shaded their laughter, that had watched the children grow, that had heard his vows without ever needing words. He laid wildflowers across her grave, the ones she used to tuck behind her ear when she thought no one saw. Then he sat beneath the swing, hat in his hands, the sign above him catching the last light of day. The wind came soft over the fields, carrying a faint hum, a woman's voice still singing. Long after both were gone, travelers passing the ridge would slow their wagons to read the weathered sign. The house stood gray but proud, its door open to the wind. The letters on the fence still clear despite the years, "Not for sale." And in the quiet after sunset, when the air turned gold and the oak's shadow stretched long, some swore they heard laughter in the wind, the sound of a cowboy and a woman who had once turned dust into home. Because some things, love, mercy, the right to stay, were never meant to be bought. She was once a girl the world called worthless. He was a man who had lost too much to believe in miracles. But in the dust and silence of a forgotten house, they found something neither had expected, a second chance at love, built not on wealth or promise, but on kindness, patience, and the courage to stay. Their story reminds us that redemption doesn't arrive with grand gestures. It grows quietly, in every meal shared, in every hand held, in every heart that refuses to close no matter how much it's been hurt. Some things, like love and mercy, are never meant to be traded or sold. They're meant to be lived, guarded, and passed on. So tonight, wherever you are, may this story remind you to hold tight to the people and places that make you feel at home. Tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your story. And if you still believe that compassion can turn even the hardest soil into something living again, don't forget to subscribe and stay for the next tale that warms the heart through the quiet.